I'll kick us off. Good evening. My name is Aaron Leung. I'm one of the co-chairs of Vision Vancouver. I want to thank everybody joining us virtually tonight for coming to this important conversation. I want to start by acknowledging that we are gathering on the unceded and traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. All of us have a role to play in reconciliation. As we've seen over the past month, there's much more work to do. At our last event on rematriating the city, Indigenous panelists invited us to review and become more familiar with the 94 calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and I want to echo that invitation tonight. On behalf of the board, I want to welcome all of you to Let's Act, confronting anti-Asian racism in our communities. Vision is committed to having these important conversations that impact our communities, our neighbors, and folks who we welcome to our city. As a Chinese Canadian and the child of immigrants, I'm so inspired to see so many people come out tonight to hear from our amazing panelist speakers and community leaders on what we can do to combat anti-Asian racism. With that, I want to thank our panelists and everyone in attendance for coming. And I'll turn it over to Nimmi Takkar, one of our board members and tonight's moderator, to kick off our conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Aaron, and welcome to everyone to our event today. Like Aaron said, my name is Nimmi Takkar, and I'm a current board member of Vision Vancouver, and it's an honor to be facilitating today's discussion on how we confront and address anti-racism. I personally got involved with Vision because I felt like Vision Vancouver was the kind of political party that understood me. I saw people that were running for office that looked like me, and they were talking about ensuring that communities like mine were at the table when decisions were made about what kind of city we wanted to live in. And so, this is a perfect event that I wanted to be a part of, given my original involvement with Vision was really inspired around issues of diversity. So like all organizations and political parties, Vision needs to continue to do the work of engaging and learning, especially around issues of anti-racism. And that's really what today is about. We want to learn together and act together. Over the last several years, we've seen a heightened number of hate crimes in Canada, from attacks on Jewish communities, mosques, Sikh temples, and other incidents promoting fear and hate. Here at home in Vancouver in the past year, there has been an astounding increase in anti-Asian hate crimes to the tune of 717%. There has been 98 reported cases over the last year. That's more than all of the US cities combined, leading to Vancouver being dubbed as the anti-Asian crime capital of North America. I also want to acknowledge the fatal hate crime that happened in London, Ontario earlier this year. Among the murdered were 4 generations of the same family. And although this senseless act seems in some ways really far away in Ontario, we know that it has impacted our communities and communities all across the country. And there's been a huge public outcry to address racism all across the country as well. Stories like this are alarming, and we know that we must work together in community with each other to address and confront racism. We want to live in a city where everyone is safe and feels like they can belong. And with that, I would like to introduce today our esteemed panel who will share their reflections on how we can make this a reality. I will just tell you a little bit about each of them, let them say hello, and then we'll get to know them a little bit better through some questions that we have for them. And I'll tell you a little bit more about how you can participate and ask them your questions directly. Firstly, I'd like to welcome Alan Wong, who is the longest elected school board trustee in Vancouver. Welcome to the panel, Alan.
Thank you, Nimmi. Glad to be here, and glad to listen to all the panelists this afternoon and to bring that back to board for action. Thanks, Nimmi.
Great, thanks, Alan. Next, I'd like to introduce Minister George Chow, MLA George Chow, who's the Minister of State for Trade, former City Councillor and current MLA to Vancouver Fraserview. George has been involved in the building of the Chinese Cultural Center in Chinatown and has been heavily involved in a lot of community building in Chinatown now and beyond for decades. So welcome to the panel today, George.
Hi. Hi, everyone.
Excellent. And next, I would like to introduce Ash Almani, who is the principal and co-founder of Bunyad Public Affairs, a boutique strategic communication and public affairs firm committed to building healthy, inclusive communities. Ash is also very involved in her community. She serves as the vice chair of the Board of Governors at Capilano University and also serves as the chair of the District of North Vancouver's Community Services Advisory Committee. Welcome to the panel, Ash.
Thanks, Nimmi. Thank you for joining everybody today. And I just want to acknowledge I'm joining you from the traditional unceded territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh people.
Thanks for that, Ash. And last but not least, I would like to introduce Mo Dhaliwal. And Mo has been a tech entrepreneur, business strategist, visionary leader. He organizes people into movements and really works to promote. And he's actually not last, apologies. He's second to last, but not last, and definitely not least. But yes, Mo's work is really around promoting inclusivity and shattering cross-cultural barriers. And Mo, I know you're the founder of the Vancouver International Congress Celebration, and you've been involved in heaps of arts organizations and just our community builder in general. So thanks for joining us today on the panel.
No, thanks for including me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Excellent. And now, last but not least, I would like to welcome my friend Tesicca Truong, who is a community engagement innovator and anti-oppressive dialogue facilitator and a serial change maker. Currently, Tesicca is working in the BC government. Thank you for joining us today, Tesicca.
Thanks so much for having me, Nimmi. It's a pleasure, and I'm really looking forward to this really important conversation with all of you.
Excellent, me too. Now that you know a little bit more about our panel, I want to tell you about how you can participate today. We definitely want to hear from you directly. Please use the chat function to ask a question, and please do promote the event, talk about the event so that your friends and family can tune into this important conversation now or a little bit later. Please do use the hashtag Let's Act Van on your social media channels. And with that, I would like to pass it on to Alan Wong to provide some opening remarks for our event.
Great. Thanks, Nimmi. Thank you very much. It's really wonderful to have the opportunity to join you all tonight discussing racism. Challenging racism, and in particular, confronting anti-Asian racism is a huge task for our city and our school board. It requires a concerted and collaborative efforts from all of us as community members and advocates, as well as from all elected officials. As a school board trustee, my focus is on student health, both physical and mental health, and as well safety in the school system. It's vital for all students to feel a sense of belonging when they are at school. All students and staff need to understand that racism is not acceptable. Full stop, period. Racism is not acceptable, period. The school board has been fighting to tackle dueling challenges this past year: COVID-19 and racism within the school system. Both of those are two main topics in this term of the school board. As a school board trustee, I have worked to foster a school environment that promoted multiculturalism and empathy towards others, while also fighting anti-racism. There's the nice part about multiculturalism I wanted to foster, but the focus with regards to anti-racism is something that is a priority in the last year or so. I always wanted to be on the diversity committee, and I chose to be on the diversity committee of the Vancouver School Board, as well as on the City of Vancouver's Racial and Ethnocultural Equity Advisory Committee, REACE for short. And in the past, we called it the Anti-Racism Advisory Committee. As everyone heard, in the past year, racism spiked considerably. I won't just say anti-Asian, but all types of racism. I witnessed a tremendous rise in anti-Asian racism in particular in the broader community at the beginning of the pandemic. We all heard about that. Even though schools were closed at the time, I knew we had to tackle and take action. It was time to deal with the realities of deep racism, both in the broader community and in the school district. So at the school board, over those number of months, I introduced, as a vision trustee, introduced several important resolutions. The first one being in May of 2020, that focused on investigating incidents of racism. And by the way, all these were adopted unanimously by all trustees after they were introduced by myself. So dealing with investigating incidents of racism, communicating zero tolerance right from the top, as from the Board of Trustees as an organization, and as well committing resources to address racism, not only with regards to policy, but with resources to tackle in the schools for students and for staff. Since then, we have done some important policy work. We updated our board policy 21, anti-racism and discrimination. From there, we overhauled administrative procedures 170, 171 to support individuals in the event of racism. I know these board policy, admin procedures and numbers just sounds like numbers and a little boring, but they are very, very impactful and required to be done for the school board and the district. We know it's important to collect the evidence. That's why we, the Vancouver School Board, through another vision motion, issued a call to action for the Ministry of Education to document and track incidents of racism in schools in BC. We also know it's important to be loud and clear. That's why we proclaimed May 10th, 2021, the Day of Action Against Racism. And we need to stand with our allies to be stronger allies. That's a priority as well. That's why we shared our endorsement with the Stand with Asians Coalition. It's not only one part of the community that needs to stand up, everyone needs to be allies. Things are changing and we are all learning together. This year, back to school in September, we'll start with a full day of mandatory anti-racism training for all VSB employees. That's every VSB employee, from SMT, the superintendent, all the trustees, staff, youth and family workers, custodial staff, everyone has one full day mandatory anti-racism training. The focus will be on anti-Black, anti-Indigenous, and anti-Asian racism. That's a first and that's a priority. And as well in there, I think bystander training is important as well. And I hope during this evening's discussion, we'll talk a little more from the panelists about bystander training. These are all important and encouraging steps, but we have more work to do. The board is currently working on the anti-racism and non-discrimination strategic plan, the first ever as well. Pound #Stronger Together VSB. The engagement process just completed and will be presented to the board on September 17th and adoption likely in November at the board. So we usually have a 5-year strategic plan. We call it the Education Strategic Plan. This year, this time, we're going to adopt, for the first time ever, a standalone anti-racism strategic plan. And I'm looking forward to that. So I'm looking forward to hearing from our panelists tonight, who are all working in different spaces in the public, private, government sector, and as community advocates. So I'm looking forward to hearing, and I'll turn it back to Nimmi. Thank you, Nimmi.
Thanks, Alan. It's great to hear about some of the good work happening through the school board, and thanks for your advocacy. Next, I would like to just get our discussion started. Let's dive in with a question for Tesicca and Ash. Can you talk a little bit about your experiences, as Asian women growing up in Metro Vancouver? And I'm very curious to hear from you if you think things have changed, or and how things have changed I'll pass it to you to kick it off, Tesicca.
Sure. Thanks so much, Nimmi. And I too want to acknowledge that I am calling in from the unceded territories of the Halkomenums speaking folks of the Esquimalt and the Songhees nations as well. And I guess before I begin, I also wanted to share my Chinese and my Vietnamese names as well, because I think Tesicca are the names that were given to me by my parents in English, but my grandfather gave me the name Zhang Chiying or Zhang Chiying, also known as, and then in Vietnamese would be Truong Tu An. And I think it's really important for me to share those names in these spaces. I started to reclaim that a couple years ago because I realized that it was a real sense for me, like a gauge of like how comfortable do I actually feel about my own Asian identity in a space, in a room, and to really like to unpack some of that internalized racism that I think, especially growing up in Canada in a on unceded Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh territories, that was just so ingrained, right? That I didn't learn my language, I didn't learn my culture. I was taught to, try to be more Canadian. I don't speak Vietnamese, and I'm fluent in French, and that was my parents' wish to really try to make sure that the racism that they experienced in this country because of their accent was not perpetuated onto me as well. And so I think there's lots of pieces where I think the racism that I face now is certainly not the same as the racism that I face or that my parents faced when they first came here. Like I think my dad remembers signs that said like no dogs and Chinese in the park, right? And that's definitely not the racism that we see anymore, but it's insidious, right? It's pervasive anti-Asian racism, and not just anti-Asian, as we know, anti-Indigenous, anti-Black racism, all forms of racism, Islamophobia as well. And it's not, I don't think there is any silver bullet to solve racism. It's genuinely, I think, about changing hearts and minds and education, and that this cultural change that we need to instill. And certainly there's a huge role for politics to play for that. But it's also a broader conversation in the community that needs to happen. Yeah, I hope that answers your question, and I'll pass it off to Ash.
Thanks, Jessica, for getting us rolling here. So I actually grew up in Pakistan, and I moved here when I was 16. So I grew up in a place where everybody looked like me. And then I came to a place where no one looked like me for the most part. And so that was an interesting movement from being sort of the majority to being a minority member of a minority community. And I think it's interesting, Tesicca, you speak about language, and language has so much. I learned my native language is Urdu. I learned Urdu and English back home, but we actually learned English first. And that was because my parents had moved, my dad had moved from multiple countries over time, and English was the global language that allowed our family and my grandparents to be able to survive in multiple countries and be able to still land jobs. And so when we moved here, it was just sort of natural that English would be the language. So, it was interesting transition moving to Canada. And one of the things that I'll just say are, we would always have conversations at home about what was happening in the world. And it wasn't, it wasn't always politics, but it was always awareness of what's happening in the world around you, what's happening in your city, what's happening in your country. And when I would go to public events where, conversations were happening, talks, things like that, you look around the room and it's sort of, oh, I'm the only young person of color in the room. Why is that? And so that for me was sort of at a fairly early stage, one of the questions that I would always ask myself, and it's what has led me to pursue public health. It's what led me to do the work I do now and to get involved in politics, because here we can, like in Pakistan, if I was running for office, there'd be a whole host of threats that would be in my path because of who I was, because I was a single woman running for office in Pakistan can be a threat to your life. It is a much safer thing to do here. And yet, when we look around, political rooms, political arenas, who do we see? When we look at leadership positions, who do we see? When we look at our decision makers, who do we see? And I'm really, really glad that we're having this conversation today, but it's not that the problem is a new one. It's existed for a long time. So, and I think, it's taken folks like Tesicca and others on this panel and others in this room to shine a light and get involved and bring others along to be able to transform the governments and the leadership that help build our cities, which is a really, really critical piece because we all live in it, right? We all live in it. And so the inequities, even though COVID's highlighted them today in this last year, they've existed for a long time. So I'll pause there. Nimmi, I know you want to bring others into the conversation, so I'll stop there.
Well, you know what, Ash, actually, I'm going to ask you the next question because you talked a little bit about, a little bit about why it matters to have representation. And you yourself, along with Tesicca on our panel, have run for office. And I would love to hear about your experience and a little bit about why you think it matters right now for women of color to be running for office. And during your run, I would love to hear about, what your experiences with racism were like on your campaign trail. So
Sure, I'll comment on it a little bit, and it's I think those in the room who have been part of campaigns or have run for office themselves can likely attest to this experience as well. You're doing just as much work as your fellow candidates and your opponents, and you're not getting traction, and then you wonder, is it me? Is it the environment? What's going on? And there's multiple factors at play. So I think as a younger person running for office, when I was running, I was not that young. I was 32 at the time, which, I mean, we have mayors around this metro region that are that age, and as we do MLAs. And so it was not unusual, but it was interesting, people's perspective. Oh, well, people are polite to your face. Everybody's very polite to your face, but what they're saying behind your back and how they're perceiving you is quite different. I'm really proud of the attention that our campaign drew and the mark that we left on the many people who got involved, the many people of color, friends, family, many people who stepped into the fray to support me. I'm very grateful for them. But I think it was also a transformative experience for them to be involved in a civic process and to be able to understand that they have agency, that they have a space, that they have a voice. And beyond my campaign, many young people who were who started on my campaign then went on to do other things in government or elsewhere, which was fantastic to see. So I think that gives me hope, because I think until we take on these challenges and confront them, we're not going to transform society. So I'll turn it over to Tesicca. I'm sure she has lots to share from her run in Vancouver as well.
Yeah, I love the question. I'm really, really happy to share. I ran for because, well, there's lots of reasons I ran, but I think one of the reasons that I ran was really about this question of representation, that people need to see themselves, right, reflected on the ballot. They need to see themselves involved in campaigns, not just as volunteers, but in the leadership of those campaigns as well. And that was some of the big goals, in addition to, of course, we were running to win, but we knew that it was an uphill battle in the campaign that I ran in Vancouver Lingara. But I think I had all these other goals about bringing in people who had never volunteered on a campaign, who never donated before, who never voted, who couldn't even vote because they were PR and hoping to be a Canadian one day, but could still donate their time and their energy and their resources and their networks to all of this. And look at the transformative work that women of color are doing, in the political space, right? Look down to the states at AOC, up here with MP Mumalak, Kakak, the representative for Nunavut, who unfortunately is not running anymore, or isn't running in the upcoming election. But I think we know that we need a different type of leadership, right? The same old leadership that brought us into the climate crisis, that brought us into the housing affordability crisis, that unfortunately has been negligent of the opioid crisis or the poison drug supply crisis, is not going to bring us out of it. We need different types of leadership. We need folks with diverse lived experiences and backgrounds. And part of that like, what's so insidious about racism? I often talk about racism. I do some work as an anti-racist, anti-oppressive trainer, and I talk about racism as this poverty of imagination, right? This poverty of imagination for, in order to be able to imagine what leadership looks like beyond, you know, in a young woman of color, you know, and it's the stereotypes and the stories that we've been fed by traditional media, by social media, that tells us that someone of a certain race can't be this, can't be that. We've only seen them as an athlete or as a rapper or as a dancer. You know, like, it's that poverty of imagination that limits not just the folks themselves, but really limits the spaces that they enter into. Right. So it's not that, I think something that I kept on telling my team was that it's not that we don't belong in these spaces. It's not that we don't belong in politics, because we kept on going into spaces where we're like, oh my goodness, we're the only folks of color. We're the only younger ones. We're the only queer ones. We're the only women of color. And I was like, it's not that we don't belong here. It's that we don't belong here alone. So let's go together. Let's run together. Let's build teams. Let's build coalitions. Let's lift each other up. And I'm really proud. A couple of the folks that worked on my team had shared with me that they were thinking of running, and Allison Gu, a dear friend of mine, has now been elected in a by-election in Burnaby City Council, right? And maybe I'll just end off with AOC and something that she said that really, you know, when I was on the fence trying to think about, should I run or not? Like, you know, I had to move, like, it was a huge decision. Of course, a life-changing one, as I'm sure Ash and many others on the panel know. I was watching Knock Down the House, which for those of you who haven't seen it, it's on Netflix. It's great. It's about her and a whole bunch of their young progressives that were running in the States. And she said, hundreds of us need to run in order for one or two of us to get in. And something clicked, like just as she said that, I was like, I'm down to be one of those hundreds. Like, hundreds of us need to go, and some of us will make it and some of us won't. But we need to support each other. We need to lift each other up, right? And it's this Asian solidarity, but beyond that, right? How do we bring Indigenous voices? How do we support Indigenous voices to actually be heard? Black voices, other folks of color, because there's such a need for that.
Thank you for that, Tesicca and Ash. I feel inspired and excited by what you have to say, and I have no doubt that our audience listening today, I know that you will have inspired one or two of them to hopefully raise their hand to get involved, because I know you're getting me really amped up. And I really appreciated, Tesicca, your phrase around a poverty of imagination. I will definitely be thinking about that as we go through the panel today. Next, I want to bring in to the conversation MLA George Chow, who has been one of those diverse voices at the table and doing community building over the last 20 years, whether it's in his role as an MLA or as a city councillor. And so, George, I'd love to hear your reflections on confronting and addressing racism, and what, if anything, has given you hope or energized you over the past decades to keep up the good fight.
Thank you, Nimmi, and I'm very happy to be here, to be invited to this panel. And I'm speaking, you know, on the traditional territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh peoples, with whom we share this land and their hospitality. And it's nice to all of you are here. And I just certainly want to reflect on the conversation that's been going on and what Alan Wong is reporting regarding the school board. And, you know, it seems like VSB is doing a lot. And also very inspired by Ash running in politics in Pakistan, and Tesicca as well. And so I'm obviously the oldest person here. So I'm the elder. So I came when I was 14, you know, from Hong Kong. And of course, you know, this choice was selected by my parents. And of course, because our family's association with Canada dates back many, many years. Like my grandfather was here in 1911. So this year we celebrated his arrival in Canada for 110th anniversary, you know, 2021. So the fact that I was not here earlier is to do with, you know, discrimination and immigration law, and so that's not the forum. But really, when I landed here at age 14, I speak a little bit of English, coming from Hong Kong. And of course, I've been living here for over half a century. So dealing with racism, confronting with racism had been, all along. And what I would call the missing the bus syndrome is that when I was young, I would be running for the bus, and sometimes the bus wouldn't stop. And I was always curious whether the bus driver, who were, basically all male, white male back in those days, didn't see me, or they saw me, but because the skin of my color, they choose not to stop. But so that's really just rhetoric and the kind of thing that I've been always wondering living here. But all in all, I really agree with what Ash and Tesicca is saying, that running for politics, but running for politics is not the destination. It's really a journey. I think people appreciate, even though they say, "Oh, a politician is this and that," but I think people do appreciate people who took the time and sacrifice to run for politics, because it means, involvement and contribution. So I think that's great. And of course, I got into politics because of, the stuff that was happening in Chinatown, that I came to Vancouver, and I live in Chinatown. Yeah. And I live in a SLO. It's a single room occupancy hotel. And back in those days, we know we were the minority. We know we were second class citizen in that sense. Not that's also something that we feel back in those days. And so we were of the older generation, along with my dad, that we know we have to work hard, and we kind of keep our heads down, and that. But of course, now I'm very happy that the younger generation, like what's represented here, are taking a different track, and I think we have to, because they're born here, they're Canadian, and they're also understanding that fighting racism requires everybody's involvement, and that requires, from my observation, the Chinese community, all in all, in the past decades, had always been, yes, working hard, but kind of keeping out to ourselves, and not really involved with politics and the community. So I think that's a good change, that the younger people say, hey, we are part of the community. We are part of this great nation. So we should participate, and we should fight for our rights. And so I think that's great. And I think that really does give us hope. And I think from the government's point of view, in answer to a lot of the program that Ellen is doing, we will be bringing in legislation in terms of dealing with racism, because I think using the laws that we have is cumbersome, and it may not be effective. So we need to bring in legislation to deal with racism. And one of the things about bringing in the legislation is also going out to the community to seek opinions, see what people think. And Nimmi, when you mentioned that we are the hate capital of the world against Asians, I was quite alarmed when I first heard it, because I always thought, hey, yes, we have discrimination, we have prejudice, and we have racism here, but I didn't know we are the leader. So we really need to dwell into the statistics. It's a good thing in the sense that, we need to work on it. And as such, we, aside from bringing back the Human Rights Commission, we need to do more, which is really to enshrine in the legislation that racism is not acceptable, and that we will prosecute the people who perpetuate this kind of crime. So I think that's very important. And let's hear somebody else, and we could hear from the people who may want to ask us questions.
Great. And that's a great reminder from George that if you do have a question from us as you're listening in, you know, we've touched on a lot of topics and you may want panelists to expand on something, or there may be something on your mind, please do go ahead and go ahead and submit your questions through the chat function and we'd be happy to take your questions. Thanks for those updates, George, and specifically about telling us some of the work that's underway on the Anti-Racism Act. Next, I want to talk to Mo. And you may remember from my introduction, Mo Dhaliwal has been instrumental in the founding of the Vancouver International Bhangra Celebration. Some other work that he's done has been through Cultural Olympiad, producing programming that engages South Asian community, and I know the list goes on and on, Mo, of the community work that you've done to, you know, to really create opportunities for people to be seen and celebrated, which really is an excellent counterpoint to fear. And so I'm wondering from you, what reflections you might have from your work to foster healing and societal change that have given you hope or had the biggest impact on your work?
Mm-hmm. I think it was the realization that I was complicit in harm. So I'm going to expand on that point. So a lot gets made about, the founding of the Vancouver International Bhangra Celebration Society and my work there. And I can't speak for the organization, but I can speak to the reflection I've done over the years about personal motivations, right? And when I look back on it, I know that the 10 years I spent there as the founder and volunteer board member through all of it, it was in the search of legitimacy in white power structures, right? It was in search of, white adjacency. And to some extent, it was kind of in service to the status quo, right? That festival, for as much, I think, connection to my own identity and history and culture that it gave me, and a sense of belonging I was trying to create for myself and others, I think, to some extent, might have even propped up some of the cliches and tropes that people of color, marginalized people in this society are meant to perform. We're meant to show up in very singy, dancey, model minority ways. And that's the bar for our acceptance, right? We're not allowed to have social issues. We're not allowed to have mental health issues or show up in society in any way that is seen as quote unquote negative, right? Because we're not the default. And what is the default? The default is white supremacy. And white supremacy at its core is the thing that creates space for racism like this to exist, right? It's, we're still existing in a hub and spoke model of diversity. We can't even get over, changes in melanin yet, let alone different perspectives and viewpoints. And that's one of the issues, right? Is that we sometimes overemphasize the importance of, and I'm talking even within diversity inclusion circles, and where we're looking for representation. Yes, on media, on TV shows, it feels amazing to be seen. But sometimes there's so much focus, even within circles of allies, so much focus put on, melanin and bone structure, that we don't necessarily look beneath the surface and say, what are those people representing? Because I can tell you from my experience that I know plenty of people from my community that prop up white power structures because they draw their legitimacy from that, right? I know plenty of people from my community that actually, will support harmful policy as long as it doesn't quote unquote affect them, right? That will actually support the status quo. And so whether it was the Bhangra Festival or today, I feel like this whole time, what we've been doing and the thing that we have to keep explaining is that we've been negotiating the severity of the problem, right? George Chow spoke about his earliest experiences, and from then till now, we'll get people in the community sometimes that might point to George's experiences till today and say, aha, progress, right? Because it's, it's all neat and tidy on this linear scale of full-blown hate crimes and hate messaging as the norm to less of that, right? And so this whole time, in my context, and I feel, again, I'm here for a confession as much as participation. I feel like we've been negotiating the severity of racism without dismantling the structure of it. The structure has not changed. This is a failed white nation that was ruled by the stormtroopers of genocide. And neither the country nor the RCMP have ever had to contend with that, right? These are our most powerful structures in this country. Then you advance that to even the baby structures of violence that they birthed, which was the various provincial and municipal policing bodies. They, of course, adopted much of that cultural DNA and continue to reflect it, right? And that's why in quote unquote today's day and age, in this current moment, we actually have a police chief in Vancouver that denies structural racism, right? And the fact that a person like that can espouse these opinions and hold on to their job blows my mind. And so there's a virus that infects the body. And if nothing else, we've understood what pandemic response actually takes, right? And I want to actually use the pandemic as a metaphor for racism and hate in this country, because before we had these massive spikes of infection and death, this country and its governing institutions were ready to take action on a scale and breadth and expense that we have not ever seen, ever. And it's because they were at risk. But when it's Black, Brown, Asian, Indigenous bodies at risk, that urgency isn't there, right? And we've seen that from parts of the country where you have the water crisis through to how police operate even in our own streets here in Vancouver. And to stamp out a virus like that, you need a pandemic level response, right? You need to chart a course that says, no pun intended, but here's our vision for what this place has got to look like. And then you have to run in with urgency as if the house is on fire today, because for many people, the house is on fire, right? Our bodies are at risk, right? We have Asian grandparents I've heard of, right, that have been instructed by their grandkids to not go for evening walks, right? This is 2021 we're talking about, right? We've got, family members that are, living in certain parts of town and might catch a bit more attitude these days than they did before. And it isn't that, I think this racism increased by 717%. I think the level of reveal is 717%, right? Quoting Tupac Shakur, if a friend ever turns on you, they were hating from day one, right? And that's sort of what we're dealing with. So I think for whether it's these cultural groups and institutions, again, some that I was a part of, or whether it's our governing bodies, municipally, provincially, federally, I think we actually have to look at what real action looks like, right? And too often, action it feels like a tranquilizer. It feels like the thing that we need to sort of get the right conversation going in the present moment, but without actually advancing the agenda in any meaningful way. And I often use this metaphor that it's like trying to boil a pot of water with a candle. And multiculturalism told us for decades that, hey, minority, you just got to hold, you shine bright enough, you hold that candle there and, that pot's going to boil. And it's not, we need a goddamn blowtorch. We need something that is far more intense in its pressure. And we need to meet the moment of hate with the severity that the moment of hate meets us with, right? And we don't see that because, with all apologies to this panel, incredibly intelligent, reasonable people here. But our reasonability and our intelligence, I think, is also what prevents us from perhaps going out and threatening the institutions that need to take action. Because as we've seen, when the status quo of white power structures is threatened, we've seen what a pandemic level response looks like, right? And we can't be a pandemic, but what we can do is threaten those institutions of power, because when they're threatened, we've seen they will act, right? And that's not, to some extent, that's just a human trait, right? We've seen that even with climate change. One of the best motivators, unfortunately, for climate change has been forest fires and this heat wave, right? And sadly and unfortunately, old people dying, right? Because, you know, humans aren't motivated by theories all the time. And since the 70s, we've been told that climate change is coming and to move forward, but, you know, information doesn't move us. The threat is now moving us. Whether it's too late or not, we don't know, but the threat is now mobilizing and moving us. And similarly, if we're dealing with hate, if we're dealing with racism, structural, overt, violent, we need to threaten the institutions that can make the broadest change and the most impactful change quickly. And that's to George's point about legislation, right? Why would any sitting body of power bring in legislation, right? Unless their roles and positions of power were threatened, right? Unless these became election issues, unless we threatened to take them out of power, right? Only then are they really motivated to act. So, you know, I think the cultural production and participation in my life, you know, has been a big part of it. And when I first started it, you know, it was more almost instinctual, right? I had just moved back here from California. It was post 9/11. The world was kind of reconfiguring itself. I was trying to find a place for myself as well. And I didn't even have the articulation to share some of these ideas. So I fell into these natural Canadian modes of pacification of, you know, oh, you want to do multicultural stuff, here's how you do it. And it took me the better part of a decade to learn that actually I might be propagating the harm that I'm here to reduce. And thankfully these days we have, I think, a bit more articulation, a bit more knowledge. We can leapfrog some of those steps, but it has to be with urgency and it has to be at every level. It has to be education, it has to be our systems of power, it has to be government.
Thanks for those reflections, Mo. I really appreciate your honesty in the work that you've done and how it's both contributed and perhaps and contributed in ways that you possibly didn't intend for it to. Tesicca and Ash, I saw your hands both go up while Mo was talking, so I want to pass it on to you to share your thoughts. I'll pass it to you first, Tesicca.
Okay, thanks. Well, I think I was really responding to what you're saying, Mo. And first, I wanted to thank you for naming white supremacy as the root cause, or one of the root causes of this, because I think when we look at whether it's anti-Asian racism, whether we look at the history and the ongoing like impacts of colonization, anti-Black hate, like it's all related, right? And it's linked back to white supremacy, right? And Mo, I actually believe that there's a space, like there's a need, there's an urgent need for advocacy and activism. But I think that can also look like a lot of different ways, right? The reason why I share that is because I feel like I came from, like my roots are from environmental organizing. Like that's where I grew up. That's where I found my community, where I found my place at first. And the anti-racism, the anti-oppression work that I do, I didn't necessarily choose it, right? Like it was just thrust upon me as one of the few or the only non-white folks that were in the room. There was just this expectation of like superior level of knowledge around racial equity, right? And so I had to skill up, I had to learn, I had to find ways to resource myself, because regardless of whether I liked it or not, I was seen in a certain way. I was fetishized from a very young age. I was, you know, all these things, and I'm sure you have similar and also different experiences, right? Being a racialized man, right? And I think we need to reframe the problem as well, because I think so much of the onus and the burden falls on folks who are actually racialized themselves to do the education, to do the emotional labor. And certainly, like, I think we have lenses to this that are only, unfortunately, the definition of privilege is that you don't see it unless you actively do the work to learn or to unlearn, or you're exposed to or have relationships to folks who are constantly experiencing it, right? Like for me, my partner's Black, and it's like living in Victoria right now. Not that I think that Vancouver necessarily would be better, but the amount of horrible stuff that we experience is just on a completely different level on a day-to-day basis than I would experience as an Asian woman, right? Because there's also parts of that stereotype, parts of the poverty of imagination of what an Asian woman can be or can do, you know, submissive, you know, quiet, like whatever, you know, name the stereotype, that also benefits me, right? That racial profiling, for example, by the police, Asians are underrepresented, are actually stopped and frisked less than white folks, right? And so there's parts of that privilege that we actually benefit from as well. And that's why I think when you talk about that lateral piece, like we need to examine and to talk about, within the Asian community, there is so much anti-Indigenous hate. There is so much Islamophobia. There is anti-Blackness, and there's also colorism, right? There's so much, I think we need to talk about, there's so many layers of complexity within this because we've internalized that hate. We've internalized that the racism that was imparted on us. And then I want to add a piece around generationally, because I don't blame my parents for not speaking up. They did what they did so that they could survive, right? It was a different world that they came into. It was a different sphere of possibility. There were physical, and there continues to be physical impacts, physical harm, like threat to your life and to your livelihood if you speak up, right? And if you agitate and you resist, right? But I think the level of discourse and the level of knowledge and awareness has also changed. And I think that's why for folks like you and I and Ash and George and others, I think Nimmi, we have a different political possibility, like spaciousness to breathe and spaciousness to act up and to speak out. That, certainly there are still consequences of me speaking out and you speaking out, but they aren't the same. They aren't the same, right? And I think that we need folks both inside the system and outside the system, right? I think there's so many different forms and ways of doing the work. And I think we need to accept that or recognize and to validate each other that, the way that you approach the same objectives and the same goals might not necessarily be the way that I do it, but that there's value and that there's importance, and that, an activist on the outside can shift the Overton window and shift the political possibility for the conversations that are happening. But we also need folks on the inside that are going to support those legislations, like the work that Minister Chow or George Chow is doing, and to push anti-Asian race, or to push anti-racism legislation, and to make sure that there's good, consultation, deep consultation with communities of color who are actually impacted by this, so that the legislation is actually driven by the communities that will be disproportionately impacted. And that's what's not been done in the past, is that we have folks who don't represent the community necessarily, who represent only certain sections of the community, who have been making decisions that disproportionately impact so many of us, right? And that's why I believe politics is a space that we absolutely must fight within, because I realized, I've been working for over a decade of my life in environmental activism and civic engagement activism, but there were limits to what I could do outside of the system. There's limits to what I could do as the head of a nonprofit organization, right? There's limits that I could do outside of the governing systems. But there's also so much power and so much need for exactly what you're talking about, the activism, speaking out, not sitting down, right? And I think for me, a really powerful moment was last spring, when the pandemic had first hit, but the Black Lives Matters movements, right? That people weighed that decision oh, I might get a virus, but it's so important to me that I need to show up in the streets, that I need to visibly be there to say, this is not okay. This is not okay what is happening in the States, but not just in the States, right here in Canada, to Indigenous and to Black folks. And I'm okay to risk my life to get maybe a virus because I need to show up. And for me, that it was a moment where what I'd been struggling with, and I think many of us have been struggling with, seeing at home alone, disconnected from one another, we needed a place to grieve and to rage and to agitate, right? And to say, this is not enough. But yeah, I think I really resonate with a lot of the frustrations and the disappointment and the rage, really, of, I think when you see the world through a racial equity lens, and some of us don't have a choice whether we see it or not, or experience it or not, there's a lot to be upset about.
Thanks, Tesicca. And Ash, I'll give you a couple minutes to comment as well.
Sure. I have so many thoughts running through my head right now, listening to everyone. I'll say this: we're all a little bit racist inside. We're racist towards the community that's not ours. And we see it and we feel it in different ways. George mentioned riding the bus, and I love transit. It's one of the things I love most about experiencing the city, is to ride transit and see who's on. Um, I have lots of friends in Vancouver. I don't have friends who were born and raised in Vancouver. And that's an unusual thing for a white person to hear, but it's not an unusual thing for a person of color to hear in this city. Sorry about that. And we have to ask ourselves why. Why is it that our social networks look different? Why is it that the people who ride the bus are not in the halls of our city, are not in City Hall, speaking to the things that they care about? Why is it that the street names don't reflect the names of people who you might see on the bus? I think the bus is to me is a place where it's sort of, you see everybody, all walks of life, all colors. It's kind of really reflective of our society in a lot of ways. And it's like, well, if you ride the bus and the conversations on the bus and the people you see on the bus and the stories you hear on the bus, why don't those inform our power structures? Why are those voices not the voices our leaders hear? And we got to ask ourselves that question. There is a huge inequity playing out there. Tesicca mentioned, her interest in this is through the environmental movement. Mine is through public health. And guess what? Racism is a public health issue. Racism is a public health crisis. And COVID may have shone a light on it, but people in public health have known this for a long, long time. The public health inspector that called out residential schools and the murders that were happening there wrote their report in the early 1900s. It was no mystery what was going on there. And so, we look at the instances of Komagarumaru. We ask, why are there sushi restaurants, and why can I find sushi and biryani in every small town in BC? There's a reason. People got pushed out. They got pushed out of living in certain parts of our province. And that's embedded in our history, right? And it has affected where people have chosen to live, where they have raised families, how they participate in their daily lives. It affects, if tonight at the end of this, if you get to shut down the computer and walk away and not think about racism again, that's your privilege. I don't get to do that. None of us here on this panel will get to do that, because we will still continue to be people of our various cultural and ethnic backgrounds, still experiencing the city in the ways we live in it. So I'm a strong believer in change starts with us, but it starts with all of us. It starts with the people who are listening to this conversation. It starts with the people who are reading the headlines in the newspaper about anti-Asian hate. And what are you going to do about it? Right? Because it can't just be Mo or George or Tesicca or Nimmi or I or Ange or Aaron or Alan who are putting this panel together. It has to be all of us. And those actions look different for all of us, but it's exhausting to keep talking about it. Part of the coping mechanism for many people of color is to simply go about their day-to-day. We know we have to work twice as hard to get half as much. You don't really want to think about it all the time. You just fucking do it. Sorry for swearing. But that's the reality, right? You pick yourself up and you move on and you keep doing the work that you need to do because you believe in what you're doing. And so people who look different from us need to do that work themselves. And I'll end there.
Thanks, Ash. And you've touched on a point that one of our participants has asked about. So one of our participants has asked, how do we engage in meaningful change and dialogue when the response is so often framed in white fragility? How do we build allyship and dialogue without expending so much emotional labor and conflict management to get there? So many of us are just exhausted. So if it's okay with you, Ash, I'll just get you to start us off on that one.
I mean, I think we have, there are allies in every space. I'll start there. So that, finding who your allies are. And sometimes, it's finding the other person of color in the room to be able to hash out a plan to figure out what you're going to do. Unfortunately, that is that is the reality. Yeah, I don't have any clear solutions. I think there's a lot of writing and reflection and reading that I have to do in my work to stay sane. I'm sure others as well, but we rely on other people in the room to be there for us, just in the same way that we look to other people of color to support us through these journeys.
Tesicca, I saw you wanting to weigh in there.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I just really wanted to build on what Ash was talking about and to share. Like, I think depending on, like, for folks of you who are racialized that are listening to this, I have a different message than for folks who are coming, who are hoping to learn about racial equity. I think there's a distinction between having that lived experience and folks who are building. And I think for those of us who have that lived experience, there's still more that we can learn. But for folks who are the only non-white folks in very white dominant spaces, my message is like, take care of yourself, and find places that charge you, like restore your energy, that bring you joy, that spark you joy, because you're so important. And it's hard to be in those spaces. Like, I think it's okay to acknowledge that and to almost expect that there will be a certain level of gaslighting. I don't even like the word microaggressions, because I think there's nothing micro about microaggressions, right? But that you can choose how much labor you take on, right? And that if people are asking too much of you, I hope that there is that spaciousness to give yourself permission to not blame yourself for other people's racism, to not blame yourself for not doing enough, or to question why, I said that thing once, I said that thing twice, said that thing so many times and it still hasn't been heard. Because sometimes it's not you, sometimes it's the space that's not ready for you, right? You can lead a horse to water, but you can't force a horse to drink. And sometimes I've been in spaces where I'm like, this space is not ready for this level of truth, right? That white fragility, that defensiveness, that unwillingness to acknowledge that it is racism that's showing up in their spaces. Because we've been taught that racism is bad. And therefore, if I say something that's racist, I am bad, right? And people have that resistance. Like, no one wants to believe, oh, I'm bad and I'm inflicting this harm and that I'm complicit, as Mo was saying earlier, right? But I think we can differentiate, and as Ash was saying, that we all have prejudices, we all have biases that we've been taught and that we've learned through our communities and that we've learned through the broader society that we need to unlearn, and that we need to name and to identify as problematic, right? And that's hard work. That takes a lot of self-awareness and reflection, and also a lot of deep learning, right? To do readings, to do the work, to learn what you don't know, because you don't know what you don't know, right? And so that's my invitation for folks who are coming here, and as Ash so beautifully put it, have the privilege of turning off or jumping off this Zoom call after this is done, and to not have to think about racism until they're reminded of it in the news or they hear about it through a news story, right? That, you have the privilege of opting in and opting out, whereas the rest of us, or many of us, it's death by 100 cuts, right? We don't have a choice in whether we face it or not. We don't have a choice in how it comes and in the ways that it's so insidious. And the function of racism, or one of the impacts of it, is that it's exhausting, right? That if I actually stopped and dealt with every single racist incident that happened to me in a single day, I would never get my job done, right? There's so much racist, sexist, classist BS, as I'll say politely on this call, and more, right? Because there's also non-visible portions of my identity that are also marginalized. And it's about for folks who are racialized, how do you preserve your energy? How do you take care of yourself? And how do you take care of others who are also potentially in spaces like this, that are really struggling, who are really alone, who are really feeling gaslit, isolated, not valued at all, dehumanized in so many ways, right? And how do you save your energy so that you can recharge yourself, but also those who need you, who have those shared lived experiences? And the last thing I'll end on, and I think this is really important, and if you can walk away with anything that I've said, because I know I've rambled a bit, but is about the power of caucusing, the power of finding folks who understand your lived experience. Because another function and the way that your brain protects yourself when you're in psychologically unsafe situation is through confusion. To be like, there was something awkward there. Like, I was really confused. Like, what happened? I'm not really sure. Right. And I would invite that often it's not that you don't know what happened. You don't know why that was uncomfortable or awkward, or, it was actually your brain protecting yourself from realizing how much danger, how much hate, or how much harm is being put your way. Right. It allows you to stay in really harmful spaces. Right. And unless you have other folks to caucus with who also have lenses on how insidious racism is and can help you validate and actually understand and process that experience, you stay in the dark, right? And caucusing is one of the most powerful tools for folks who are racialized, for folks who are queer, for folks who are disabled, for folks, name the intersection, for them to move from a space, for us to move from a space of unconsciousness to consciousness about how racism is affecting our daily lives.
Thanks for that, Tesicca. George, I apologize. I think I missed your hand up earlier, and I know you've been doing this work for a long time, so I'd love to hear your reflections.
Oh, I was just reflecting on COVID and, this racism that came out of it, because you obviously know that during the Second World War, the Canadian government interned its own citizens of Japanese descent. And I have always wondered whether such an act can happen. And up until now, I thought, no, we probably learned the lessons and they won't happen. But I think based on the COVID racism rhetoric, even though politicians were not prominently involved, there was only one politician who was questioning the loyalty of a Chinese Canadian public health officer. But you could see, given the right social condition and the social conflict, that can happen. And that was directed to the Chinese, because the COVID started supposedly from China from Wuhan. So you could see, given the right condition and the right leadership, particularly down south, and that. So what that means to us is that we have to work hard on fighting anti-racism. There's no resting. I mean, but on the other hand, like Tesicca said, you cannot expend all your energy on that. You also have a life to lead and to contribute, right? So we cannot let that consume all our life. But it's, I think that really is the way I look at it, because I kind of found my answer that yes, that things like that can happen if people do not take action, do not get it together, and I think that's certainly a very very important thing. And and the other thing that I also found out in the U.S., you have the Black movement that all really expose the underlying racism in the U.S. That still, despite the fact that they elected a Black president and 2008, but to me, things really haven't improved, and it's exposed itself during this conflict. And in Canada, I'm only learning in the last decade and a half what the residential school is all about. And really, that also exposed us as Canadians to the racism that's really going on. And I think that's certainly what I learned from these two episodes, the COVID-19 and our residential school. It's something that, like you said, Nimmi, that is something that we have known, or maybe it was Ash who said it, that we have known that before, like residential school. But for us who are not Indigenous, it really never hit home. We just say, oh, okay, that's part of history. Now, when you really think about it, if it's your kids your grandkids, they're being taken away. And I think you could really appreciate what the Indigenous people were going through and still continue to go through with the systemic racism that they face every day. Yeah.
Thanks for that, George. Mo, I'm going to bring you back into the conversation next with a question from MLA Brenda Bailey. Thank you so much, MLA Bailey, for joining the conversation today. And their question is around the Sons of Odin Proud Boys who are active in BC. And the question is, how do we respond to the hate that they espouse? Some worry that a heavy hand to shut them down will feed the movement, but to let them share their view is vile and awful. And so, she wants to hear what the panelists think is the best way forward. So Mo, I'll let you kick off this question.
Unmute. When you look at the initial reactions to, the Proud Boys or acts of hate that happen, there's this knee-jerk thing that happens, and you see this all the time, and I hate seeing this phrase, there's no room for this in Canada, right? There's no space for racism. There's no space for this sort of act in Canada. Whereas the reality is there's lots of room, there's lots of space. That's why they're operating here, right? Because this is a part of Canada. So I think what we actually need to do when we see, movements like this rise up is it's not enough to ignore them, but I think we do need to frame them for what they are. And it's a really tough line to walk because, how would suppression of these groups happen? It would happen through, legislation. There was, some conversation around the Proud Boys being officially, regarded as a terrorist organization in Canada. And I'm going to speak to that a little bit, and more to underscore how difficult it is, rather than provide a solution, because I don't have a good one. Some hailed the declaration of the Proud Boys as a terrorist organization as a victory, right? It was like, finally, we're recognizing white terror. And on its surface, I was one of those first voices as well. I was like, yeah, this is good. We're finally recognizing white supremacy as terror. But then you go back to the systems again, right? And it's a carceral, policing-based approach and militaristic approach to how we address terrorism and how we deal with terrorism. And what we already know is that cultural policing-based approaches disproportionately affect Indigenous people, Black people, people of color, right? So to give, organizations that are fighting domestic terrorism even more powers broadly is actually going to hurt more people of color, right? And so I think when these groups are mentioned, incidents happen, this stuff comes up, I think the first thing we need to do is actually kind of embrace it and say, this is a part of Canada, what are we going to do about it? And we do need to take a position on it, because there seems to be a lot of discourse around what's happening and how it's happening. And even media, I feel like, the idea that there's an unbiased media, I think, is kind of false, because the media kind of brings the bias of the moment to everything that's reported. And I think we actually need to speak to the fact that, Canada is riddled with racist groups like this, some that are in the foreground, like Sons of Odin or Proud Boys, and many others that operate, behind the scenes. And we haven't fully embraced that yet. Like, we're talking about two groups, and nobody's going to convince me that these are the only white supremacist organizations that are operating on any level in this country, right? That's just the smoke. Where's the fire? And I just want to add one other point to the conversation that's happening earlier around their fragility, because, this is also a good example of, there being a lot of, white fragility, I think, even around the response to the Proud Boys of, if you try to tell somebody that this is a issue that is, kind of endemic to Canada and it exists everywhere, like, nobody wants to hear that. And for anybody that's wondering how to work in these spaces or what to do when there is so much white fragility around, I think these conversations in these circles often attract very, well-intentioned and highly engaged people. And that's also your Achilles heel, because when you're very, very well-intentioned and highly engaged, if somebody asks a question, you move to answer the question, right? When somebody comes and expresses, their emotions based on their own fragility and their sort of, trigger and reaction they're having to something, you move to address that. And the reality is that I think if you're faced with white fragility, that isn't necessarily your battle to take on, right? You can leave those people with some homework and say, look, you got some work to do. I can't help you with it, But if you're truly, and that's the reality, is that if they're truly interested, they'll take that confusion that is probably arising for them as well, and they'll do the work, they'll do some research, and they'll try to address it, and they'll find other means, they'll pull on that thread. If they had no interest in the first place, they're not going to do it anyways, and that conversation is wasted, right? So if you're met with white fragility, and if you see that, there's nothing that says, you know, you are burdened with needing to engage with that person and address it, right? That's not your job. You can continue being a great advocate, a great ally for all oppressed groups, continue doing the work that you're doing. But that doesn't mean if somebody stops asking you a question that you need to answer it, right? You're under no obligation.
Thanks for that, Mo. And I saw a couple of panelists looking to weigh in, but we are getting to that time that we are going to wrap up. But before we do, I do have one last closing question for each of the panelists. And then after that, we will have some closing remarks from Alan. So my big question that's been coming up for me is, what is the next step? So in your most hopeful, high energy moment right now, here in Vancouver, what do you see as an opportunity or a call to action for our city, something that we can do collectively, or that you would like to see our local government do to really address systemic racism and anti-Asian racism here in Vancouver? And George, if you could kick us off.
Well, I think living in a diverse society that we are, of course, it requires a lot of hard work. You know, I come to this realization because, racism being one. And so we really need to work hard on that. And I guess it's really through education and also interaction with other groups that we could actually bring racism down. And I think the next, of course, is what I mentioned through the government legislation. And I think that's what we need to do going forward, is that we need to combat racism through legislation and through collecting data. And we, for example, that name that we're the capital of anti-Asian racism in the whole world, I really wanted to look at the statistics. So I think it's important for us to collect our own statistics to see what BC, what Vancouver is all about in terms of that. And from that, we could actually educate, our citizens, our people. And I think it's something that I still think we live in a good community. I think you all remember that thing that was posted early in the beginning when I think he's a Chinese old man that was being picked up in a grocery store or, some kind of convenience store and dumped outside the door, just like a piece of garbage. And that really captured a lot of people's imagination. But what happened to my father in Chinatown when he fell down on the sidewalk? 2 white men in a car came by, helped him, and stayed with him until my younger brother could come and pick him up. So I have to think optimistic. I think everyone has to think optimistic that we could combat racism, that we should be doing this kind of work. And it's hard work, like I said, but we must do it.
Thanks for that, George. And next I'll pass it on to Ash.
Thanks. A couple of things. Chinese people are 27% of the population of Vancouver. I just want to put that out there. So if there's people on this call and there's no Chinese people or no Asian people in your friend circle, you got to ask yourself why, because it's not like they're not around. I also just want to say that, there's more that unites us than divides us. And I think we have to remember that. And there are people of every background doing amazing work in this city in various volunteer capacities within their ethnic communities or elsewhere within our public spaces. And as much as the incidents of hate are painful to see, let's elevate the good news stories. We are, let's make sure people really see on our media, really hear on our channels how much we are here. We are here to stay and we belong. And I think it's important for all of us in the spaces that we're in to elevate and shine a light on the positive, and to really call out the negative, call out the hate. When you see it, report it, call it out, shut it down, and be allies. We none of us can do this work in isolation. We must work together, stand together in solidarity, and that's how we build a better city, a better country. There's a lot of promise that my parents, Tesicca's parents, other folks, George's parents, we all came here with. There's something that attracts us to this place, and we can make it a better one, and that's on us. So I'll stop there, and I'm sure others have more to say.
Dash, over to you, Mo. Oh, Mo, you're on mute.
That's my favorite trick. You know, I'm so afraid of sounding negative, but I'm just gonna go for it. You know, of course, all white people aren't bad, right? That'd be a xenophobic, I think, argument to espouse. And I think, you know, this is something that gets propped up sometimes by, you know, the sort of defenders of the status quo is pointing at the specific and then using that to generalize, right? You know, there's a lot that's going well in this country, but I'm going to use another metaphor here. Like, there could be a lot that's going well in your body as an organism, right? Cancer starts pretty small, and it can kill the whole thing. And so, you know, for anybody or any organism, any body, I think that's suffering any sort of disease, right? Like, I think you need to address the disease, and I do think it's sometimes, perhaps it's our own sort of, you know, psychological safety thing of reacting and wanting to, you know, reposition ourselves into a quote unquote positive space again. But I feel like, you know, if there's a problem to be solved to some extent, you got to go to the root of that and say, what is the heart of this problem? And we have so many, you know, logical and rational people that are in positions of power that will accept the science in so many other realms. But what we're talking about today, it isn't like some weird black magic art stuff. There's a science around racism, right? There's data here. We have a police chief today that won't accept that, right? Somehow the Vancouver Police Department is a statistical anomaly where, based on the history, based on how that organization's formed and how it's empowered, somehow they have no structural racism, right? Amazing, what a utopia. In that case, we should be analyzing it to be like, how did you solve the thing that no one else has solved, right? So I by all means, I think we need to celebrate each other, celebrate the work that we're doing, but it has to be with the urgency brought to the fire, right? Brought to the moment, right? Not retreating back to the beautiful meadow and the glade and say, look how beautiful it is, but actually run into the one that's, you know, the forest that's burning and say, but we got to take care of that right now. And so I think that would be my ask to, you know, anybody on this call and the panelists to say, of course we have a lot to celebrate in ourselves, but let's keep the energy and the pressure where it belongs. And that's in dismantling white supremacy, right? And that's not an opinion. That's not, you know, one perspective. That's based on data, right? And to deny structural racism in today's moment is akin to being an anti-vaxxer. And apologies to any of the anti-vaxxers that might be participating today, but that is an opinion.
Thanks, Mo. Tesicca, I'll ask you to wrap us up with your final comments.
Yeah, I actually wanted to share a poem. I think earlier this spring, when I was really really grieving and wrestling with some of the anti-Asian hate that had been happening in our country and the ones down south. Yeah, I felt like the only way that I could transform that pain and all the raw emotions that I was feeling about it was through the arts. And so I wanted to share that. I think it's really, I think on the note that many of you have spoken about in your closing comments. It's called Walk With Me. walk with me. I am so tired. Tired of the anti-Asian racism. Tired of living in fear. Tired of the hate. I'm tired of not being Canadian enough. Tired of not being Asian enough. Tired of being told to stay quiet, to keep our heads down while our humanity is being eroded, while our Black, Indigenous, and siblings of colors are harmed, killed, while the world burns and our planet is plundered, while land, food, and people are disrespected, violated over and over again. The weight of silence carried for generations on hunched backs, sealed lips, grin and bear it. But I can't stay silent anymore. The burden is too heavy to carry. I'm bursting at the seams, rage, grief, hurt, pain pouring out. My presence on Turtle Island, these stolen lands, is political. I'm the product of displacement, political instability, a child of immigrants and refugees, a silent settler no more. Enough is enough. But I can't walk this path alone. Our elders have forged the path, crossed seas, build proud gates on stolen lands to welcome us home. Been spat on, shoved, driven out. Some paid the ultimate price. So come walk with me. That's it.
Tesicca. And with that, I'm going to ask Alan Wong to close us out. But before we do, I just want to thank all the panelists for your honest reflections today. I've really enjoyed having this dialogue with you, and I know our participants have as well. Reading the comments has been great. Thank you so much. And Alan, if you could just close us out. I know we are at the 7:30 mark already, so I hate to rush you, but I'll ask you to just close us out in the next minute or two.
Oh, you can't do that, Nimmi. I was asked to answer a question with regards to zero tolerance, what it looks like in schools, strategies, and consequences. So I'll rush through that as quick as possible, but keep in mind, everyone can reach me by email, by phone, on the VSB website. Zero tolerance is that everything is talked about. I hear from people at different committees with regards to kids at playground and their name calling, but nothing's addressed. Zero tolerance to me is part of it. This is a spectrum. This part of the spectrum is that everyone is aware, and there is a discussion by teachers, by administrators, by everyone, and there is policy for that, and procedures for that, and resources for that. So everyone needs to be made aware of that. And we keep doing that, and we have to keep sharing that. And that's a number of the resolutions that were passed. That's the short, very short. Just want to thank, I wrote notes about everyone's, all the panelists that were sharing this evening, and it was a great conversation. I see the chat a lot of people were very, very impressed and very inspired. Inspired is the word. So just gonna, and I wrote a lot down. I'm gonna quickly go through a few people. George, a longtime friend, and people probably don't know this, but George was he was on the VSB's Race Relations Advisory Committee way back before he was the famous George. So George was on the VSB Race Relations Advisory Committee in 1999, and he contributed way back then through what happening in Chinatown, all the way to the school board. The person with the reference with regards to racism is the Canadian Public Health Officer, and the school board. I brought a motion in support of supporting that person who was attacked, had a racial attack. Tesicca, thank you. Poverty of imagination. If I may use that going forward, not only for anti-racism, but for other things. Poverty of imagination is a great term, so thank you very much. Mo, threaten the institution of power. I'll agree with you there. Just 5 years ago, if we had the discussion with regards to the school liaison officers, it wouldn't have gone the direction it has gone this year. So I would agree with you with the regards to threaten the institution of power. So thank you very much for that. And Ash, thank you for working with, it was great working with you in the past with regards to engagement. Your comments with regards of being in the room and to have allies in the room and seek other people in the room. I think people of color probably understand this more than others when you walk in the room, and as a person that does engagement. Thank you very much, Ash, for sharing that. And I would like to further the discussion with regards to the residential schools and public health and the knowledge of that and what has not transpired in the early 1900s. So thank you, everybody. I look forward to staying in touch. The question with regards to zero tolerance and strategies and consequences, that's going to be further discussed. A very first start of it is September the 7th when school starts. Everyone gets that anti-racism training. And I think, and I hope that encourages the reporting of incidents, minor, major, spectrums there. Also, there is the consequences. We have a whole procedure with regards to district student of code of conduct that addresses racism as well. We are all pound, hashtag stronger together VSB. I look forward for everyone staying in touch. Thanks as well to Nimmi, Aaron, and Vision Vancouver's board, and many volunteers for hosting this evening's event. And this is a very important conversation. And actually, honestly to say, the greatest conversation I've had with regards to a political organization having that discussion. So all around a great evening. Thank you. Nimmi, back to you.
Thanks, Ellen. And on behalf of the Vision Vancouver board, thank you again to our panelists, to Aaron for providing us the opening, and thanks to all the participants who made this event so rich with your comments and questions. Thank you for joining us. Have a great evening, everyone.